Hello, and welcome to my sideboard guide for Temur Control, best of 3. So this is a list from week 8, and was the one that was running the 2 copies of Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy. So not every list is running this, but I do think after looking at the data that I'm relatively impressed by Kellen, and I do think you might want to consider it for your list. So this list is running 2 Philology Archaeologists, which, as we'll see, is not particularly impressive, and I do think we should end up cutting it. Aftermath Analyst, 4 copies. World Souls Rage, 4 copies, which is the deck's primary win condition. 2 copies of Vampire's Vengeance for a cheap board wipe, as well as a blood token to help us dig for an answer. Nissa Resurgent Animist, which allows us to, whenever our sack land goes and finds a swamp, you get 2 landfall triggers, so each time you get 2 lands that you can use. And then it also lets you dig through your deck for elves, if you have, helps you find Aftermath Analyst, backup copies of Nissa, as well as the Titania Voice of Gaia, which is a which is a legendary creature, sorry. That gives us some really good, I hate this interaction, which gives us some really good life gain against some of the aggro decks. So it's got some good synergies there. 4 Memory Deluge, 4 Ill-Timed Explosion, another Wrath, Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy, which can help us kind of out-ramp our opponent or gain the land advantage against our opponent. And then 4 copies of Virtue of Strength, and these do stack. Keep that in mind, that if you have multiple Virtue of Strengths in play, you're going to be able to tap for a bazillion mana. And then, 30 total lands, and sideboard options, we've got 1 in the Festivities, 1 Turn the Earth, 3 Negates, 2 Tranquil Frillbacks, 1 Lithomantic Barrage, 3 Abrades, 1 Shigeki Jukai Visionary, 1 additional Vampire's Vengeance to the 2 in the main, Titania Voice of Gaia, and then Doppelgang, which is a nice alternative win condition if they have like a Stone Rain to remove all of the World Souls Rage. It's nice to have a way to still win the game. So with that, I'm going to go in through all of the matchups specifically and kind of give you my thoughts at the end about how we can improve upon the deck. So welcome to my best of 3 sideboard guide for Temur Control. The reason why I started doing this was because I was frustrated with the sideboard options that I was finding on Google. A lot of them were behind paywalls, and a lot of them were opinions. And opinions are okay, but it's also nice when we can lean on data. So I use Untapped, which is a MTG tracker, and this allows me to kind of remove the bias of what I think might be good and see what the unbiased data has to say. So with that, what I like to do is I like to look at the top 8 most common matchups on MTG Goldfish, which is a website that tracks tournament data in best of 3, and then use the Untapped tracker in those matchups. So I'll take the list that I just showcased in Arena and look up the win rate versus the most common archetype. So for this one is Temur Midrange. And so what we can see here is that the 3rd copy of Vampire's Vengeance should probably be brought in. And then the worst card that is not a sideboard option is the Philology Archaeologist. And then we, it's not a perfect system. There are some cards that are commonly used in the sideboard and not seen a whole lot. So then we run into this low data issue. What we can do is we can look at what we can do is we can look at what alternative lists are doing in the Temur Control. So this is a good way to look for missing options. So top of the list here, we can see that Temur Control lists are running Splendid Reclamation, and the ones that are doing quite well against Temur Midrange, and then as well as Spelunking. So both Splendid Reclamation and Spelunking would be worth running against Temur Midrange if you had them. And then what we can do as well to kind of look at alternatives is opening it up to all archetypes. So using the list of the Temur list, the Temur Control list, we can then look up what the win rate of that one card is in all archetypes against Temur Midrange. And this is a good way to look for things that work, cards that are really good against the archetype specifically, that shine in other archetypes as well. You got to take this one with a grain of salt, though, because it's not necessarily going to have the same win rate when it's in Temur control. And what we can see here is that nothing really pops out. So my sideboard suggestion for Temur Midrange is to bring in the 1 copy of Vampire's Vengeance and cut out 1 copy of Falaji Archaeologist. Again, the missing options are Splendid Reclamation and Spelunking. Vampire's Vengeance works pretty well against the small flyers like Deep Cavern Bat, Spyglass Siren, and Fairy Mastermind, while Falaji Archaeologist, many of Temur's early threats are flyers, and Falaji Archaeologist in theory can block Gix, but it's going to trade, or I guess chump, unless it whiffs on finding a spell and is a 1/4. Not particularly useful. And then next up we have Esper Midrange, which is the second most common archetype according to MTG Goldfish. And from here we can see that we should bring in a 3rd copy of Vampire's Vengeance. We should bring in the 1 copy of Turn the Earth. We should bring in the 1 copy of Shigeki Jukai Visionary, as well as 1 copy of Doppelgang. And then we should cut 1 copy of Aftermath Analyst, 1 copy of Ill-Timed Explosion, and 2 copies of the Falaji Archaeologist. Again, alternative strategies. We can see here that Spelunking is at the top of the list. So if you were deciding to run Spelunking, this would be a good archetype to bring it in. And then as far as all archetypes go, nothing stands out in particular. So for Esper Midrange, what I suggest we do is we bring in the 3rd copy of Vampire's Vengeance, bring in 1 Turn the Earth, bring in 1 Shigeki Jukai Visionary, bring in 1 Doppelgang, cut 1 Aftermath Analyst, cut 1 Ill-Timed Explosion, and cut 2 Falaji Archaeologists. Again, Spelunking would be a good option if it was available. So Vampire's Vengeance hits Deep Cavern Bat and Fairy Mastermind, while Turn the Earth is good at removing Dinnik from their graveyard, as well as potentially fetching back a World Soul's Rage from the graveyard. Whoop. Shigeki Jukai Visionary is good at getting World Soul's Rage back after like a counterspell, and Doppelgang is a good alternative win condition if they've sideboarded in Hate against World Soul's Rage. Aftermath Analyst is weak to instant speed removal, like cut down and go for the throat, making you have to save it until you can immediately pop it at 6 mana, 2 to cast it, and then 4 to activate its ability. And they might be running Tishana's Tidebinder, which hurts to sacrifice this for 4 and then get nothing. As well as Kutzel's Flanker can also be brought in to flash away the graveyard after you sack. So notably here, you could take out a 2nd copy of Aftermath Analyst, but the data does suggest that Ill-Timed Explosion is comparable. So if you really love Aftermath Analyst, alternatively, you could take out 2 Ill-Timed Explosions. I've decided to go with 1 of each. And Rafine is the #1 target, and Rafine can quickly get out of range of the Ill-Timed Explosion unless you are discarding a Virtue of Strength. Ill-Timed Explosion, a lot of times you're discarding something for 3, like a Nissa or a Vampire's Vengeance, and so the 4 toughness can kind of escape the reach of the Wrath. Either way, though, Falaji Archaeologist is definitely not great. It can come out like Temur. Most of the early threats in Esper Midrange are flyers or are going to be quickly pumped by Rafine outside of the toughness of Falaji Archaeologist. The 3rd most common matchup is Boros Convoke, and here we can see Titania, Voice of Gaia. It would be a good one to bring in, as well as 1 copy of Turn the Earth, 1 copy of Vampire's Vengeance, and 1 copy of Doppelgang. The cards that we can cut are Falaji Archaeologist, as well as 1 Nissa Resurgent Animist, 1 Aftermath Analyst, sorry, this is on this side here, and then 1 Ill-Timed Explosion, which is also on this list here. Alternative strategies, we can see that there are none for Boros Convoke. And then for all archetypes, In the Festivities does stand out. And this is why I look at all archetypes, right? Is that In the Festivities is in the sideboard specifically for Boros Convoke. So my suggestion here for Boros Convoke is that we bring in Titania, Voice of Gaia, Turn the Earth, Vampire's Vengeance, and Doppelgang, and In the Festivities. Take out 2 copies of Philology Archaeologist, 1 Nissa Resurgent Reanimist, 1 Aftermath Analyst, and 1 Ill-Timed Explosion. Notably, there are no missing options. Titania, Voice of Gaia, creates a ton of life gain, which helps against the aggression of Boros Convoke. Turn the Earth is good at removing Yoshin Frontliner from their graveyard, and can give us more life gain for stabilization. Vampire's Vengeance destroys most of their go-wide strategy. Voldaren Epicure and Sanguine Evangelist won't get hit, so keep that in mind. Doppelgang is usually thought of as a response to something like the Stone Brain or the End that removes all of your World Soul's Rage, but Imidane's Recruiter is a pretty spicy target to get multiple copies of. And then In the Festivities hits Voldaren Epicure, Resolute Reinforcements, and Gleeful Demolition, and in my opinion, should be brought in. Philology Archaeologist, again, blocking Boros Convoke, and especially when you're not trading or getting rid of their board, isn't really going to prevent them from going wide and then overrunning us with the Imidane's Recruiter. So we can cut both copies of Philology Archaeologist. Nissa Resurgent Animist is better for gaining a mana advantage over our opponent, and against this matchup, we just need to survive their pressure instead of racing them for who has the most mana. Aftermath Analyst, I was a little surprised to see Ill-Timed Explosion tied with Aftermath Analyst, so once again, you can feel free to cut 2 copies of either Aftermath Analyst or vice versa and cut the 2 copies of Ill-Timed Explosion. I'm going to cut 1 of each. Ill-Timed Explosion lines up quite well outside of the Knight Errant of Eos. Again, the 4 toughness kind of makes it a little bit tricky. And then Boros Convoke is actually pretty good at rebuilding from a Wrath. So I can also use that to justify going down 1 copy of the Ill-Timed Explosion. Next up on the list is the Mirror Match, Temur Control. And against the Mirror Match, this one I think is a bit surprising, and I want to know what you guys think, if this is just an artifact in the data or if there is some logic to this. So the top of the list is Vampire's Vengeance, and then we should also bring in a copy of Doppelgang. And then the worst performing card in the main is Philology Archaeologist. As far as alternative strategies go, there are none that are standing out in other lists. And then as far as all archetypes go, again, we don't see anything that stands out too much. There is a little bit of a negate near the bottom. So against Temur Control, my suggestion is that we bring in the 1 Vampire's Vengeance, we bring in 1 Doppelgang, and we cut the 2 copies of Philology Archaeologist, and notably there are no missing options. So Vampire's Vengeance seems like an odd suggestion again, because I believe all of the creatures in the Temur Control lists have 3 toughness. So it's one of those things that you would have to cast like after combat, and I think just because like you can cast it to get a blood token to then discard something to draw is kind of weak dig, if that's kind of giving its advantage. I really can't figure out why it's at the top of the list. Worst case scenario though is that we can just discard it to Ill-Timed Explosion, and maybe it's in there because you can cast multiple times to get rid of things like Kellen or the 3 toughness, or as well as adding in the Festivities to hit everything that has 3 toughness. You have to double spell though, so I'm going to give it a shot just because, like I said, I do think it's going to be better than Philology Archaeologist. But let me know in the comments below if you think this is an artifact in the data, or if it does have some utility that I'm just completely missing. Doppelgang does make sense though, since we can use it to copy an enemy's Virtue of Strength, and if they haven't already won, kind of use it to win the game, and it gives us an alternative win condition. And then Philology Archaeologist is mainly to gum up early aggression, and it's not something that you really have to worry about in the Mirror Match. Next up is Domain, and Shigeki Jukai Visionary is at the top of the list, so we should bring that one in. Notably, this is a very favored matchup for this archetype, 80% win rate. And The worst one on the list is just barely below 80% at 79.8 and is Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy. So we can bring one Kellen out. And then we hit into no data. It is relatively low, notably. There's not a whole lot of match data for Domain. And then as far as missing options go, again, nothing that we aren't already running, except for maybe the Echoing Deeps in the land. And then as far as all archetypes go, nothing really pops out. Now, there is an asterisk here. Something funky happened because Negate should have been in this list just because of how good it is in other archetypes. Negate is a common spell that you bring in against Domain to counter Sunfall, and it was coming up as no data, and I don't know exactly why. I double checked my settings. I did it multiple times. I could get it to pull up if I brought in Negate just by itself, but when I had it in the list, it wasn't bringing it up. Doesn't really matter for this, just because like I don't think we should be bringing in Negate against Domain anyway. But it was something that I thought I should disclose. Sometimes the Untapped Site gets a little funky. So for Domain, we have a really straightforward strategy. We bring in the one copy of Shigeki, and we cut a copy of Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy. So Shigeki is good for bringing back World Soul's Rage after they cast something like 8 or Counterspell. And then Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy. Domain isn't pressuring us or playing any tasty artifacts, so the 3/4 body is not as important. Matches up kind of poorly against the Archangel of Wrath anyway. And we're going to win the race in land, right? They're going to win it for a little bit with their Topiary Stompers and their invasion of Zendikar, but we're going to get to the point where we have 30 lands and they're just sitting there with like 10, right? So we'll win the land race in the long run. Versus Mono Red Aggro, we can bring in the 3rd copy of Vampire's Vengeance and then cut 3 copies of Virtue of Strength. Yeah, and then sideboard options, and then no data. As far as alternative strategies go, we do see a couple starting to be explored. So we have Into the Fire, which allows us to hit everything for 2, or we can discard our hand and then draw that many cards. Light Up the Night is an X damage spell that... so World Soul's Rage has 2 and an X, right? So a Light Up the Night is just X and a red. And this allows us to more cheaply cast our direct damage spell, which is good because Virtue of Strength is the one, it's too slow for the mono red matchup. So it's pretty common to run something that can double your single X spell against mono red, like Chandra's Hope, or Chandra Hope's Beacon, which is the Planeswalker that can copy an instant or sorcery, or Galvanic Iteration, which is another one that if you cast for a blue and a red, you can copy your next spell, and it has flashback for a blue and a red to do it again. So instead of hitting into this multiple lands thing with the Virtue of Strength, what the plan is against mono red, or at least what the plan against mono red could be if we brought this in as a sideboard alternative, is to cast Galvanic Iteration and do a double spell for 10, X equals 10. As far as all archetypes go, we can see Tranquil Frillback come in here, and Mono Red Tranquil Frillback has been a card that is pretty good to bring in as a sideboard option against Mono Red Aggro because of the 4 life gain. So my recommendation here for Mono Red Aggro is to bring in the 3rd copy of Vampire's Vengeance, the 2 copies of the Tranquil Frillback, and cut the 3 copies of Virtue of Strength. And then again, we could bring in Into the Fire, Light of the Night, Chandra Hope's Beacon, or Galvanic Iteration to make our matchup stronger against mono red. So Vampire's Vengeance destroys most of their aggro strategy, and then Tranquil Frillback can destroy enchantments like Kumano. It can exile Squee from the graveyard, and it can gain 4 life to help stabilize against their aggression. Whereas Virtue of Strength is just going to be way too slow for the mono red aggression and match speed. Then we've got Azorius Control, and here we should bring in the 1 copy of Turn the Earth, 1 copy of Shigeki Jukai Visionary, and 1 copy of Doppelgang, all the way down there on the bottom. And then we can cut 2 copies of the Vampire's Vengeance. Azorius Control does have some stuff that they can build, but it does take time, so our board wipe is not super great. You can hit like the 2/2s off of Wandering Emperor, the 1/1s off of Mirix, but it's not going to be super important to do, and we still do have the board wipe of Ill-Timed Explosion. And then Philology Archaeologist, again, we can cut 2 copies there. Alternative lists, Splendid Reclamation makes it into the top 10, but is not in this list specifically. And then Colossal Sky Turtle allows us to loop with Shigeki infinitely at the channel level, right? So we're not really casting any spells, which can be really good because then a lot of their counter spells are not particularly useful against that loop. And then if we open it up to all archetypes, we do see that Negate pops in here, but relatively low, number 9 on the list. So my recommendations for Azorius Control is that we bring in the 1 copy of Turn the Earth, 1 copy of Shigeki Jukai Visionary, 1 copy of Doppelgang, and 1 copy of Negate. Cut 2 copies of Vampire's Vengeance, 2 copies of Philology Archaeologist, and then again, this would be a good matchup if we had Splendid Reclamation for the land advantage, or Colossal Sky Turtle to do the channel speed loops that are activated abilities, so they can't. Azorius Control has a harder time interacting with them outside of Tishana's Tidebinder. So, excuse me. Turn the Earth can hit their flashback cards like Memory Deluge. There's a couple other flashback cards that we've seen kind of come and go from Azorius that it could hit as well. But Shigeki helps us get back the spells that were countered, again, at that channel speed that is more difficult for them to interact with. And then Doppelgang gives us an alternative win condition if they are running something like the Stone Brain that removes all of our World Soul's Rage, or if they are really good at shutting down or having multiple counter spells ready to shut down our 1 spell. So Doppelgang can give us an alternative win condition. And then Negate allows us to counter their Planeswalkers, their own counter spells. So what we can do is we can counter their counter spell if they hold up 1 for our World Soul's Rage or Doppelgang. So it could be an okay one to bring in. And again, I do think it's better than the Philology Archaeologist. So Vampire's Vengeance, like I mentioned, is not particularly good against their board state. They do have a couple of things, but we can live off of the Ill-Timed Explosion. And then again, Philology Archaeologist is not particularly good in this matchup because it is better in those matchups where it's trying to protect you from the early aggression. So the Azorius Control is not pressuring you particularly fast, so you have lots of time to find what you need to find. So overall sideboard impressions, there were... Oh, really quickly, the 8th most common archetype is the new Temur Control, has taken over, is more popular choice than Golgari Midrange, and but it is too new of an archetype for me for there to be a whole lot of data. So we'll pick that one up later if it does become a more common occurrence after Outlaws at Thunder Junction. 2 sideboard options didn't show up in the data at all, and that was Abrade and Lithomanic Barrage. And not to say that they're bad cards, it's just that they are not commonly brought in a whole lot of matchups. Right, like Lithomanic Barrage is specifically to blue-white hate, and then Abrade for artifacts. Right? So if you come up against Azorius artifacts, you'll definitely want them. Negate only came in and only 1 copy in this whole process, and that was against Azorius Control. And I think it's probably included in anticipation of answering things like the Stone Brain or the End, where people are trying to, or I guess Unlicensed Hearse, where people are trying to specifically attack your strategy in their sideboard. But I think with alternative ways to win, like Doppelgang, I don't think it's particularly necessary, and I'm going to suggest cutting it. The other thing, too, was that Philology Archaeologist was in the bottom in several matches, and in the top really only against Domain. So I think we can get away with cutting the 2 copies of the Philology Archaeologist in the main and explore some alternatives. So it could be replaced with a copy of Splendid Reclamation, which was good against Temur Midrange and Azorius Control. And then Spelunking could also be included, as it was pretty good against Temur Midrange, Esper Midrange, and Azorius Control. And then as far as like exploration in the sideboard, I still think that, nothing's set in stone. And again, this whole process is something that's supposed to be just a useful tool, so take it with a grain of salt. But I do think a copy of Into the Fire could be interesting. Kind of gives us a fourth Vampire's Vengeance, and then it could also be, which would help against like mono red. And then it could also be used to discard your hand to dig for World Soul's Rage in the end game. And honestly, it might just be better than the Vampire's Vengeance because of being able to discard multiple cards to then filter to what you need to draw to get your combo working. I don't know, something to think about and something to explore. And then Galvanic Iteration could also be considered for the sideboard. It would be to better help against mono red, because most of the time with the Virtue of Strength, then you don't need it, right? But it does have the advantage of being able to speed up your combination against a fast matchup like mono red. So if you've made it to this point, thank you very much for listening to my best of 3 sideboard guide for Temur Control. And please let me know what has been working for you and what you think. I do think sideboards always make interesting discussions. And this is a weekly series, so if you'd like more content like this in the future, remember to click like and subscribe. And I'll be covering mono red aggro eventually, I think next week. Maybe if we get Dimir Control enough. No, I don't think I can do it in time, right? So I'll be covering mono red aggro next week for the first Friday after the release of Outlaws at Thunder Junction. And that kind of will finish up the top 8 for Murders at Karlov Manor, and then we'll restart the process for Outlaws at Thunder Junction as we get more data for that set. So once again, thank you so much to my YouTube members. I really appreciate the support. And if you would like to become one, you can click join to watch a little trailer about what you would get. I'm going to be remaking that trailer, but any support is very, very much appreciated. Thank you. And good luck crushing your matches or RCQs, and maybe I'll see you on the ladder.